January 5, 1943, South Pacific waters off Guadalcanal. The light cruiser USS Helena. Cut through the morning sea as the sun rose behind her, projecting long, sharp shadows across the steel deck. The night before, she had joined other ships of Task Force 67.2 in pounding Japanese positions at Munda Airfield on New Georgia. Now the task force was withdrawing south, engines thudding steadily, crews exhausted but still tense. Experience had taught every man aboard that retaliation. If it came, usually arrived after they turned for home. On the signal bridge, lookouts scanned the horizon. Below decks, radar operators bent over glowing screens, tracing faint echoes that might turn into torpedo bombers or dive bombers at any moment. The war in the Pacific had become a contest of endurance and nerves. Sailors slept in short snatches, always half ready to race to battle stations, knowing that a dive from the clouds or a speck on the horizon could become the last thing they ever saw. Then the call came. 4 aircraft appeared as tiny flecks against the morning sky, distant but unmistakable. As they drew closer, their silhouettes resolved into the familiar lines of Aichi D-3A dive bombers, Allied code name Val. The type was already considered obsolete compared with the newer D-4Y Judy, slower and less advanced. But in the hands of seasoned Japanese pilots, the Vals remained deadly. Their accuracy, their willingness to press the attack through walls of flak, had left too many ships burning in earlier battles. The alarm klaxon shrieked through. Helena. General quarters! General quarters! Sailors dropped what they were doing and sprinted for their assigned positions. Hatches clanged. Ammunition handlers ran to magazines. Gun crews swung 5-inch mounts to their firing arcs. On the horizon, the Japanese formation steadied, then rolled into its attack. The Vals chose not Helena, but another ship in the formation. Diving through a rising storm of anti-aircraft fire, they released their bombs on the New Zealand cruiser HMNZS Achilles. The explosions walked across her decks before the attackers pulled up and turned away, their mission accomplished. In most previous battles, this would have been the end of it. Attackers fading into the distance, beyond the reach of effective return fire. But this time, something new waited for them. As the Japanese aircraft climbed away, their pilots believed they had cleared the danger zone. At over 4 miles distance, they were beyond the typical effective range of shipboard anti-aircraft guns. According to established doctrine, any shots fired now would be mostly symbolic. Angry, wasteful patterns of steel hurled into an empty sky. Yet Helena's 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns did not unleash the usual frantic barrage. Instead of hundreds of shells, only a small number of rounds left the barrels. The gunners did not scramble to dial in intricate time settings or perform desperate last-second calculations. They simply trained their guns, received the order, and fired. The shells arced upward, distant dots against the pale blue sky. The gun crews watched, perhaps expecting the familiar sight of puffs of smoke well off target. Instead, the unbelievable happened. The rounds detonated in midair, not on the aircraft, but near them, as if the shells themselves understood where the target was. A blossom of flame engulfed one bomber. It rolled, broke apart, and plunged into the sea. Moments later, another Val disintegrated in the sky, shredded by fragments from a shell that had burst close by rather than striking it directly. The American gun crews stared. They had not just scored a lucky hit. They had accomplished something that traditional gunnery tables said was almost impossible, destroying fast-moving aircraft at extreme range without a direct hit. The shells had exploded on their own when they came close enough to do maximum damage. Commander William S. Parsons, who later documented the engagement, understood at once that this was not chance. These were deliberate, precision kills caused by an entirely new form of fuze, a device that sensed the target and chose the moment of detonation for itself. To every man who grasped what had just happened, it was clear that naval warfare had quietly stepped into a new age. Hidden inside those shell noses was one of the most closely guarded secrets of the war. In terms of security classification, this device sat just below the atomic bomb itself. It was so sensitive that American leaders dreaded its capture more than almost any other piece of equipment. This small, unremarkable-looking object would prove 3 to 4 times more effective than conventional anti-aircraft ammunition. And yet, incredibly, for almost 2 years after that morning off Guadalcanal, the most powerful armies on Earth would be forbidden to use it on land. The Navy would hold it close, the Pentagon would hesitate, and soldiers would die while a revolutionary weapon waited in crates. This is the story of the proximity fuse, the fuse the Navy initially kept for itself, the innovation that the Pentagon judged too dangerous to risk on European battlefields, and the secret that ultimately helped tip the balance of the Second World War. To understand why such a powerful weapon was withheld, we must first understand what problem it actually solved. Before 1943, shooting down an aircraft with anti-aircraft artillery was a grim exercise in statistics and frustration. On paper, the concept was simple. An aircraft, small and fast, moved through a vast volume of sky in 3 dimensions. A shell, once fired, followed a fixed ballistic path and could not be corrected in flight. If the shell failed to intersect the aircraft at the right moment and place, nothing happened. 2 main types of fuses governed when a shell would explode, and both were deeply flawed. Contact fuses detonated only when the shell physically struck the aircraft. That meant a direct hit on a target moving at hundreds of miles per hour, often several miles away, through variable wind and turbulence. The odds of success were so low as to be almost theoretical. Time fuses, in theory, offered a solution. Before firing, gun crews set a clockwork mechanism to make the shell explode after a calculated number of seconds in flight. Those calculations had to account for the altitude, speed, and direction of the aircraft, its rate of climb or descent, wind speed and direction, and the complex ballistic path of the shell itself. A miscalculation of even a fraction of a second meant the shell burst harmlessly in empty air while the aircraft flew on untouched. The results were sobering. In the early years of the war, estimates suggested it could take around 20,000 rounds of anti-aircraft ammunition to bring down a single enemy aircraft. In some desperate campaigns, Norway, the Battle of Britain, figures as high as 100,000 rounds per kill were reported. Even the most optimistic calculations from experienced gun crews rarely went below about 2,500 rounds per aircraft destroyed. Those numbers translated directly into men lost and ships sunk. In the Pacific, Japanese dive bombers and torpedo planes repeatedly tore into American formations. At Pearl Harbor, at Coral Sea, at Midway, too many attackers made it through. Their bombs and torpedoes found battleships, carriers, and cruisers that, despite pouring fire into the sky, could not reliably stop them. In the Atlantic, German aircraft menaced convoys carrying food, fuel, and weapons to Britain and the Soviet Union. Merchant ships and escorts fired back with everything they had, yet often watched the attackers depart after inflicting serious damage. Anti-aircraft batteries burned through their stockpiles and came home nearly empty, with too little to show for the tons of steel they had launched skyward. The sky, in practical terms, remained the attacker's domain. Shipboard and ground-based anti-aircraft guns, though terrifying in noise and intensity, were only marginally more effective than small arms fire against determined, well-flown air attacks. Scientists and military planners across all major nations knew there had to be a better answer. For decades, theorists had imagined a shell that could sense its target and detonate automatically at the right distance, a proximity fuse. The idea appeared in technical journals and classified reports, an artillery round that would explode when it came close enough to spray fragments through the vulnerable parts of an aircraft without needing an exact hit. All the great powers explored the idea. The British began serious research in 1939 as Luftwaffe strength grew. German scientists launched an astonishing number of proximity-fuzed projects, somewhere between 30 and 50 separate programs by 1940. Among them were the Kranich acoustic fuse, developed by Ruhrstahl AG, attempting to detect aircraft by sound; the Fuchs program at AEG Berlin, which studied radio-based detection; the Grimm project, focused on electromagnetic methods; and work at Rheinmetall-Borsig on an electrostatic Kugellock fuse designed to sense disturbances in electrical fields as aircraft passed nearby. The Japanese Naval Technical Research Institute experimented with acoustic and magnetic systems of their own, fully aware of the theoretical concept. Everyone could see what such a weapon would mean if it worked, yet nobody could make it work. The obstacle was not imagination, but technology. A working proximity fuse would require a miniature radar set, a power source, safety mechanisms, and a detonator, all crammed into the nose of a shell only 5 inches in diameter. This tiny instrument package would have to survive forces of up to 20,000 times the pull of gravity as the gun fired. The shell would spin at around 25,000 revolutions per minute, subjecting everything inside to extreme centrifugal forces. It had to operate in tropical heat, Arctic cold, rain, snow, humidity, salt spray, and the chaos of combat. It had to do all this reliably, and it had to be cheap enough to manufacture in the millions. Almost every expert in 1940 would have called that impossible. Vacuum tubes, the heart of all electronic circuits at the time, were fragile glass bulbs. Even ruggedized models cracked under forces far lower than those inside gun barrels. Batteries powerful enough to drive radar circuits were bulky and slow to activate. Antennas small enough to fit inside a shell nose seemed incapable of sending and receiving effective signals. And any failure in the safety system, any premature detonation, would slaughter the very gun crews firing the weapon. Into this technical dead end stepped an unlikely visitor to Washington, Sir Henry Tizard. In September 1940, with Britain standing alone under German air attack, Tizard arrived in the United States carrying a plain black metal deed box. Inside were some of the United Kingdom's most closely guarded military secrets, research on radar, jet propulsion, and a handful of other advanced projects. Among the documents were early studies, calculations, and experimental notes on proximity fuses. The British, however, admitted that they lacked the industrial capacity and specialized miniature electronics expertise to move beyond theory. Their factories were stretched to breaking point, producing conventional weapons. They could not divert the manpower and machinery needed for such an ambitious electronic device. The task passed to the United States. On June 27, 1940, the National Defense Research Committee, NDRC, had been formed to coordinate scientific work for national defense. The proximity fuse effort was handed to Dr. Merle Tuve, working at the Applied Physics Laboratory of Johns Hopkins University. Tuve, a physicist who had spent years probing the ionosphere using radio waves, understood how to coax signals through hostile environments, exactly the sort of experience this new challenge demanded. He gathered a small group of physicists, engineers, and practical inventors from universities and industry. In August 1940, that core team numbered only 4 scientists. In time, it would swell to nearly 1,000 people working under conditions of secrecy rivaled only by the Manhattan Project. The group became known simply as Section T. Their mission: turn the long-dreamed-of proximity fuse from an academic idea into a rugged, cheap, mass-produced weapon, under wartime pressure, with no guarantee of success. Section T began with a promise and a problem. The promise was that if they succeeded, they would fundamentally change anti-aircraft warfare. The problem was that almost every part of the device they envisioned seemed to violate common sense. Security around the project was intense from the beginning. The fuse received the deliberately bland code name Variable Time, shortened to VT to conceal its true nature. Workers who handled parts on factory floors were told they were making components for ordinary electronics or explosives, Only a fraction of the scientists saw the full design. Different groups worked on separate subsystems without being told how their work fit into the whole. Meanwhile, the practical issues came at them one after another. The first barrier was the vacuum tube. Standard tubes shattered instantly when fired from a gun. In one early test, engineers installed a conventional radio tube inside a shell and recovered nothing but glass, dust, and twisted wire. Even tubes designed for harsh environments, such as those used in oil drilling equipment, disintegrated under the acceleration imposed by naval guns. The forces were so violent that glass behaved like a slowly flowing liquid, distorting and bending under stress. Internal parts telescoped into each other. Delicate fine wire grids collapsed into tangled scrap. The answer lay not in a single invention, but in a partnership. Sylvania Electric Products, which had experience in small vacuum tubes for hearing aids, began working closely with Section T. Together, they developed miniaturized tubes specifically built to survive gunfire. Engineers started with the tiniest tubes available and rebuilt them from the inside out. They added extra glass supports at key points to strengthen the structure. Lead wires were shortened to about 3/8 of an inch to minimize flexing. Tungsten alloy filaments replaced more fragile materials. Some tubes were filled with carefully chosen gas mixtures at exact pressures to reduce the risk of electrical arcing under stress. Even so, failure remained the rule. In one particularly discouraging period in late 1941, 900 test tubes were fired in succession. Not a single one survived intact. Engineers tried embedding tubes in wax. It melted from heat. They used oil. It leaked. Rubber compounds deteriorated or cracked. Plastics shattered or deformed. Someone suggested encasing the tubes in mercury. Another proposed using human blood plasma as a shock-absorbing fluid. Both ideas were actually tested. Neither worked in practice. The eventual breakthrough came from a young physicist on the team, James Van Allen, who would later discover the radiation belts that bear his name. Van Allen proposed a combination of wax and oil with the tubes set at a specific angle inside the shell. After thousands of experiments, Section T found that tubes mounted roughly 30 degrees off the shell's axis and cushioned in a blend of Sericin wax and transformer oil could survive a substantial fraction of firings. The success rate climbed to about 70%. In peacetime, that might have been unacceptably low. Under wartime conditions, it was good enough to move ahead. The battery posed another seemingly insoluble problem. Conventional batteries that could power a radar circuit were far too large and could not be kept off indefinitely, yet suddenly activated in microseconds. The solution, once discovered, was both elegant and counterintuitive. Engineers designed a small glass ampule filled with dormant liquid electrolyte and sealed it inside the shell. Around it, they arranged dry metal plates that would become electrodes. When the gun fired, the enormous acceleration shattered the glass ampule. At the same time, the shell's spin flung the liquid outward by centrifugal force, wetting the plates and instantly starting the chemical reaction that produced current. The very forces that threatened to tear the fuse apart became the ignition switch that brought it to life. The radar problem remained. Traditional radar installations in that era weighed tons and occupied entire rooms. A proximity fuse needed something the size of an ice cream cone. The transmitter and receiver had to share a tiny antenna no larger than a pencil. The circuitry had to distinguish its own powerful transmitted signal from the faint echo bouncing off an aircraft. Section T engineers devised an ingenious solution, an autodyne detector circuit, a design that allowed the same elements to both generate and detect radio waves. This circuit could sense minute changes in signal strength as the shell moved nearer or farther from a reflecting object. As the shell approached an aircraft, the reflected signal grew stronger and began to oscillate in a distinctive pattern. When those oscillations crossed a preset threshold, indicating that the target lay within lethal range of the shell's fragments, the fuse triggered the detonator. But just seeing a target was not enough. The fuse had to ignore reflections from the ocean when fired over water, ignore waves of rain or snow, and avoid being tricked by long, steady echoes from the ground. It also had to remain inert until it had traveled a safe distance from the firing gun, or a malfunction could kill the crew. Engineers therefore built sophisticated safeguards and filters into the design. Wave suppression circuits damped responses to broad, slow-changing reflections from surfaces like sea and terrain, while remaining sensitive to the sharper echoes from moving aircraft. A timed arming system prevented the fuse from becoming active until the shell had flown a certain distance from the gun, typically around 700 yards. The arming sequence itself was layered and redundant. First, the shock of firing had to trigger the battery by shattering the glass ampule. Second, the shell had to spin up to a set rotational speed, closing a centrifugal switch that powered the radio circuits. Third, a minimum time of flight had to pass before the detonator became electrically connected. If any one of these links failed, the fuse remained dormant and the shell fell as a dud. Frustrating, but safe. Only when all conditions lined up did the tiny radar set come alive, begin probing its surroundings, and prepare to detonate. After months of setbacks, a key proving moment came on August 12, 1942. The new light cruiser USS Cleveland was conducting her shakedown cruise in the Chesapeake Bay. Alongside routine trials, she was assigned a special, highly classified task: to fire a series of live shells fitted with experimental VT fuses at radio-controlled drone aircraft. The targets were small, fast, and maneuvering. Exactly the sort of enemy aircraft that had previously required vast amounts of ammunition to bring down. No one knew whether the fragile electronics packed into those shells would function when it mattered. They did. On the first day of tests, Cleveland's gunners downed 3 drones with just 4 bursts of fire. The results were so convincing that the Navy cancelled the planned second day of trials. Orders went out at once. This weapon would go into production. By November 1942, about 18 months after the project had formally begun, the first production model, designated the Mark 32 VT fuse, rolled off assembly lines. Under heavy guard and in sealed containers, the initial batches were rushed to the Pacific. By the end of that year, the Pacific Fleet had received roughly 4,500 VT fused shells, assigned only to selected cruisers and battleships. But the very success of the device made the Navy almost paranoid about its security. Instructions were rigid. VT shells were to be used only over deep water, in areas where the seafloor lay at least 100 fathoms down. Any dud that failed to explode would sink beyond reach. Firing them where they might land on shore or in shallow water where they could be recovered was strictly forbidden. Shells fitted with the new fuses were stored separately in guarded magazines. Marine sentries controlled access. Commanding officers had to personally authorize their use. Violating these rules could bring court-martial. The fear was simple. If even one intact fuse fell into enemy hands, German or Japanese scientists might analyze it, copy it, and turn the weapon against Allied crews and bombers. So when USS Helena engaged those vals off Guadalcanal in early January 1943, the ship's gunners were among the very first to fire the new fuse in actual combat. They loaded just 22 VT-fused rounds. Those shells destroyed 2 aircraft at ranges previously considered a waste of ammunition. In the after-action reports, Helena's gunnery officers emphasized the significance in understated language. The value of the Mark 32 proximity-fused projectile, they wrote, could not be overstated. Inside the Bureau of Ordnance, officials who had been anxiously waiting for this kind of field confirmation could finally exhale. Production orders skyrocketed. Contracts that had stood at around $60 million jumped toward $200 million within months. The results, once the weapon was in broader naval use, were nothing short of transformative. Throughout 1943, U.S. Navy ships fired about 36,870 anti-aircraft rounds. Only a quarter of those shells carried proximity fuses. Yet those VT-fused rounds accounted for more than half, roughly 51%, of all enemy aircraft destroyed by shipboard guns. Where conventional time fuses required roughly 508 rounds, on average, to knock down a single aircraft, proximity fuses managed the same feat with about 155 rounds. In practical terms, the new fuse made each anti-aircraft gun over 3 times more effective. The difference in the deadly area each explosion covered was even more striking. A 5-inch shell with a perfectly set time fuse, detonating at exactly the right moment and place, might project lethal fragments across something like 60 square feet. But this ideal scenario was rare in real combat. A proximity-fused shell, by contrast, would detonate when its tiny radar sensed it had reached the most effective distance from the target. Each such burst created a lethal zone of roughly 3,000 square feet, 50 times larger than the ideal case for a time-fused round. Aircraft that would have slipped past conventional explosions now flew into clouds of shrapnel that found wings, engines, and cockpits with brutal efficiency. At night, the effect was even more dramatic. Time fuses depended on accurate range and altitude data to set the fuse correctly, data which were often unavailable or unreliable in darkness. Radar could track aircraft, but translating those readings into precise timing settings under battle conditions was difficult. Proximity fuses cured this at a stroke. A shell no longer guessed when it should explode based on external calculations. It sensed the target itself. Night-kill ratios climbed by around 370% when ships used VT ammunition. Darkness, which Japanese torpedo and dive bombers had used as cover throughout 1942, no longer protected them. Admiral William Halsey, commanding American naval forces in the South Pacific, quickly recognized what this meant. Japanese torpedo squadrons that had once made devastating night attacks now flew into invisible tripwires of radar-triggered explosions. Losses mounted to unsustainable levels. By late 1943, Japanese naval aviation, already strained, found itself suffering a rate of attrition from shipboard flak that it simply could not replace. Yet even as fleets at sea gained this new shield, an entire branch of the Allied war effort remained barred from using it. In Europe, American and British soldiers dug into frozen soil and marched across devastated towns without the benefit of the weapon that cruisers and battleships had already proven. They knew of its existence. They knew what it could do. And still, to them, it remained off-limits. As 1943 gave way to 1944, the proximity fuse's reputation within the Navy became undeniable. After action reports piled up showing aircraft shot down at ranges and rates that had previously seemed fanciful, ships rearmed knowing that VT shells would make every salvo count for more. Word inevitably spread. Liaison officers, intelligence summaries, and inter-service briefings ensured that senior Army commanders learned what the Navy had achieved. General Dwight D. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander in Europe, had access to the data. The dramatic increase in kills per round, the threefold gains in effectiveness, the especially deadly performance at night. He understood clearly that if such a weapon could be adapted for field artillery and anti-aircraft batteries on land, it would save soldiers' lives, but Pentagon policy stood in the way. From Washington's perspective, the proximity fuse was too valuable to risk on land battlefields. Every artillery shell fired over Europe carried with it a chance, however small, that it might fail to explode. A fraction of those duds would land in areas the enemy controlled or could soon occupy. If German forces recovered an intact fuse, their engineers might study, understand, and copy it. This fear was not imagined. German industry possessed advanced electronics firms like Telefunken and Siemens. German scientists had already run numerous proximity fuse projects, even if they had not pushed any to mass production. Given a working example of an American fuse, they might quickly replicate or even improve it. If the Germans deployed their own proximity fuses in the dense anti-aircraft belts surrounding their cities and industrial targets, the Allied strategic bombing campaign could become untenable. Bombers already suffered heavy losses over the Reich. If German flak batteries suddenly tripled or quadrupled in effectiveness, The skies above Hamburg, Berlin, and the Ruhr would become killing grounds. Sustaining deep bombing raids might become impossible. There was a second fear as well: electronic countermeasures. If Germany faced with these hypothetical but frightening scenarios, Pentagon planners chose caution. Navy ships at sea could fire VT shells over deep oceans where duds sank into darkness. Army artillery units on land, by contrast, fought over territory that shifted hands, where unexploded shells might lie in fields, forests, or streets. As long as the Germans remained a credible threat to reverse engineer the device, proximity-fused shells were kept off the European land war. On paper, this decision made sense. In practice, it meant that soldiers in Europe continued to rely mainly on time-fused rounds that required thousands of shells to achieve the effects that VT could deliver with hundreds. German units maneuvered, massed, and attacked against artillery that was deadlier than its First World War predecessor, but still subject to the same limitations. By mid-1944, Allied armies had landed in Normandy, broken out of the beachhead, and swept across France. Yet the war was not over. German forces, though battered, remained dangerous. They pulled back toward their borders, regrouping and rebuilding for one more massive counterstroke. That blow fell in the Ardennes. Unknown to Allied intelligence, Adolf Hitler ordered the assembly of a powerful strike force concealed in the dense woods along the German-Belgian frontier. Around 250,000 soldiers, nearly 500 tanks, and some 2,000 artillery pieces gathered under a veil of secrecy. The plan, codenamed Operation Wacht am Rhein, Watch on the Rhine, aimed to smash through the thinly held Allied line, cross the Meuse River, capture the vital port of Antwerp, and split the British and American armies. With the Western Allies divided, Hitler hoped to force a negotiated peace in the West and then turn fully against the advancing Red Army. On December 16, 1944, at 5:30 in the morning, the German offensive erupted. A thunderous 90-minute artillery barrage crashed down on American positions across an 80-mile front. Shells smashed command posts, shattered phone lines, and sowed confusion. Under cover of this fire, German infantry and armored spearheads surged forward. The sector they struck was held by some of the least experienced and most exhausted American divisions. The 106th Infantry Division had only recently arrived in Europe. The 28th Infantry Division was recovering from heavy losses in the Hürtgen forest. Heavy clouds, snow, and fog grounded most Allied aircraft. There would be no immediate help from above. German panzer units pushed into the American line, creating the deep bulge in the front that gave the battle its name, the Battle of the Bulge. American artillery did what it could using conventional time-fused shells, but snow-covered ground absorbed many explosions. Shells often buried themselves in soft soil before detonating, sending much of their force upward and away from advancing troops. Observers struggled to see targets through swirling snow and smoke, making accurate range estimation, essential for time fuses, even more difficult. German infantry, shielded by weather and terrain, advanced through zones that should have been far more lethal. 3 days into the crisis, Eisenhower decided enough was enough. He sent an urgent message to General George High Marshall, the U.S. Army Chief of Staff, pressing for immediate release of proximity-fused shells for use in ground artillery. Eisenhower argued that the danger of losing the campaign outweighed the risk of German capture and reverse engineering. If the Germans broke through to Antwerp and split the Allied armies, the entire Western Front could unravel. The war would drag on, with casualties multiplying far beyond any potential harm caused by a fuse falling into enemy hands. Washington agreed. On December 21, 1944, in the midst of the Ardennes crisis, the Pentagon lifted all restrictions on the use of proximity fuses in ground artillery. The shells themselves were given a new code name, POSIT, to preserve some residual secrecy even as they went into wider circulation. Within hours, some 200,000 proximity-fused rounds left depots and began moving towards the front. Artillery units received hurried briefings. For many gun crews, the only explanation they heard was simple: These shells are far more effective. Use them. The change on the battlefield was immediate and brutal. Where time-fused shells often detonated too high, too low, or too far in front or behind, VT-fused shells exploded precisely at treetop height, showering advancing infantry with fragments. Observers no longer had to perform complex calculations for fuse settings. Gunners simply fired at known or suspected positions, and the shells did the rest. German soldiers who had grown used to ducking into foxholes or trenches when artillery came in suddenly found that the danger now came from above. Proximity shells detonated over their heads, sending jagged steel downward into positions that had previously been relatively safe. The old lessons of World War I, dig deep, stay low, wait out the barrage, no longer applied. General George S. Patton's Third Army, pivoting north to relieve the besieged town of Bastogne, received VT ammunition on December 22nd. On the very next day, one of his artillery units had the chance to put it to use. Near Echternach, in Luxembourg, a German infantry battalion attempted to cross the Sauer River to reinforce the offensive. American observers spotted the movement. Patton's artillery unleashed a concentrated barrage using the new shells. When the smoke cleared and American troops moved in, they counted 702 German dead, a single battalion effectively destroyed in one strike. Patton, not known for understatement, wrote to Major General Levin Campbell, Jr., the Chief of Army Ordnance, describing the impact. He referred to the VT-fused rounds as the new shell with the funny fuse, and stated that in the Sauer River engagement, they had killed, by actual count 7,002 enemy troops, an apparent exaggeration or transcription error, but one that captured the scale of destruction as he perceived it. He added that once all armies possessed such a shell, new methods of warfare would have to be devised, and remarked that he was glad American ordnance officers had been the first to think of it. Other reports echoed the same theme: devastation and helplessness. German prisoners captured after proximity-fused barrages struggled to describe what they had endured. A soldier from the 12th SS Panzer Division told interrogators that there was no defense against the new American shells. They burst without warning overhead, killing men in foxholes, trenches, and behind embankments. Positions that had survived countless conventional barrages were wiped out in minutes. In the Hurtgen Forest, the U.S. 8th Infantry Division used a time-on-target barrage, shells timed to land simultaneously, armed with proximity fuses against a German patrol. 96 Germans lay dead after the bombardment. There were no survivors from that unit. Across the Ardennes front, similar scenes played out again and again. Units that had advanced confidently suddenly found themselves scattered, shattered, or annihilated in open fields and forests. Within days, German offensive momentum faltered. Fuel shortages, stiffening American resistance, and the grinding impact of Allied artillery combined to slow the attack. By December 25th, the massive counteroffensive that had aimed to split the Allied armies was turning into a costly failure. Artillery alone did not decide the Battle of the Bulge, but proximity fuses gave American gunners a killing power that amplified every other defensive effort. The skies over the Ardennes also felt the new weapons' bite. As weather slowly improved, German aircraft mounted close support sorties to aid their ground forces. They flew into American anti-aircraft belts, now armed with VT shells. During the period of the Battle of the Bulge, proximity-fused fire accounted for the destruction of about 417 German aircraft. The Luftwaffe, already drained, suffered losses it could not replace. What had been its last major effort in the West disintegrated. Meanwhile, an entirely different threat to Allied operations was unfolding around the port of Antwerp. And there, too, the proximity fuse would prove decisive. Antwerp, captured largely intact in September 1944, became the beating heart of Allied logistics. More supplies passed through its docks than through all other ports combined. Without Antwerp, sustaining large armies deep inside Europe would have been nearly impossible. Recognizing this, the Germans responded with V-1 flying bombs. early cruise missiles launched from concealed sites. Beginning in October, waves of these pilotless aircraft aimed at Antwerp's port facilities. A V-1 flew at around 400 miles per hour at altitudes between roughly 2,000 and 3,000 feet. Its small size, speed, and relatively low altitude posed a difficult problem for conventional anti-aircraft defenses. Guns struggled to track and time fuses correctly against such targets, especially when they arrived in numbers. Once proximity fuses were adapted for low-altitude, high-speed interception and deployed around Antwerp, the equations changed. In one 24-hour period, defending batteries armed with VT-fused shells shot down 48 of the first 75 V-1s approaching the port. As crews gained experience, interception rates climbed toward 80%. Antwerp remained open and operational through the winter of 1944-45, feeding ammunition, fuel, and food into the Allied advance. Without the proximity fuse, the port might have been rendered virtually unusable, a logistical catastrophe that could have stalled operations for months. London, too, owed much to the same technology. Beginning in June 1944, V-1s had targeted the British capital directly. Early on, British anti-aircraft guns, aided by fighters and barrage balloons, managed to destroy less than 1/5 of the incoming missiles. The flying bombs inflicted severe damage and casualties, testing civilian morale in a city that had already endured years of bombing. When American proximity fuses arrived and were integrated into British gun batteries, the results were dramatic. By the end of August 1944, defenses equipped with VT fuses were destroying roughly 79% of all V-1s aimed at London. In 1 week that month, guns with proximity-fused shells brought down about 82% of their assigned targets. A campaign that might have forced desperate evacuation measures instead became manageable. Even as the proximity fuse reshaped the artillery and anti-aircraft fight in Europe, another, even more terrifying form of air attack was emerging in the Pacific. There, the fuse would face its greatest test. By late 1944, Japanese naval aviation was a shadow of what it had been at Pearl Harbor. The long attrition in the Solomons, the Central Pacific campaigns, and especially the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June, remembered by American pilots as the Marianas Turkey Shoot, had cost Japan over 600 aircraft and most of its remaining experienced aviators. What replaced them were hastily trained pilots with minimal flight hours, sent into increasingly desperate battles against American fleets whose radar-guided guns and fighters dominated the air. Conventional attacks by these replacements fared poorly. Loss rates climbed toward 80% or higher on some missions. Within this grim context, a new doctrine took hold. On October 19, 1944, Vice Admiral Takejiro Onishi, commanding the 1st Air Fleet in the Philippines, formally authorized the creation of Special Attack Units. Kamikaze, the first such formation, the Shinpu Special Attack Corps, comprised 24 volunteer pilots flying Zero fighters loaded with bombs. Onishi told his men that they were already beyond ordinary earthly concerns, that they were, in effect, gods. Their task was simple and terrible: crash their aircraft into enemy ships and die in the process. The airplane itself would become a guided weapon. There was no plan for return. The first organized kamikaze attack occurred on October 25, 1944, during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. Lieutenant Yukio Seki led a group of 5 Zero fighters against a group of American escort carriers off Samar. Diving through defensive fire, one kamikaze slammed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo. The impact and subsequent explosion set off secondary blasts on the hangar deck where fueled aircraft were stored. Within 30 minutes, St. Lo was fatally damaged and sank, taking 143 of her crew with her. Other carriers, Santee, Swanee, Kitkun Bay, and Kalinin Bay, were hit and damaged in similar attacks. For American sailors, the psychological impact was immediate. This was not the familiar calculus of air attack, where enemy pilots sought to survive, pulled away if badly damaged, and valued the chance to fly again tomorrow. Kamikaze pilots accepted death at takeoff. They would press their dives through sheets of flak, and pursuing fighters so long as their aircraft could still be steered. They needed only a few seconds of control at the end to turn their planes into guided missiles. Admirals and captains understood at once that existing defenses were barely adequate against men who no longer valued their own survival. The proximity fuse, already vital, now became indispensable. Emergency orders went out to equip every ship that could mount 5-inch guns with as many VT-fused shells as supply allowed. Training emphasized sustained fire at maximum range, using proximity fuses to create a dense barrier of airburst explosions through which kamikaze aircraft would have to fly. The nature of the kamikaze attack, in a grim way, played directly into the strengths of the fuse. Conventional attackers often approached in complex formations, jinking, weaving, and changing altitude in attempts to dodge anti-aircraft fire. Kamikaze pilots, by contrast, generally flew near straight paths toward their chosen targets. Their mission demanded it. They could not risk missing with a wild maneuver at the last moment. For proximity-fused shells, this predictability was lethal. Analyses showed that 5-inch guns using VT ammunition required on the order of 310 rounds to destroy a kamikaze aircraft, roughly half the 624 rounds typically needed against conventional attackers. A suicidal straight-line dive gave the fuse more chances to sense, track, and destroy the aircraft before impact. The ultimate test of this defensive system came around Okinawa. Beginning in April 1945, as American forces prepared to invade and occupy the island of Okinawa, Japan launched a series of 10 massive kamikaze offensives called Kikusui, floating chrysanthemums. Over nearly 3 months, close to 2,000 kamikaze sorties targeted the Allied fleet supporting the operation. On April 6th alone, 355 kamikaze aircraft hurled themselves at American ships. The tempo of attack was unlike anything the U.S. Navy had faced before. Even with radar, fighter patrols, and proximity-fused guns, the price was horrific. By the end of the campaign, the United States had lost 26 ships sunk and 164 damaged. Nearly 5,000 sailors were killed and around 5,000 more wounded. Yet those numbers, terrible as they were, represented a tragedy contained, not a catastrophe. Proximity fuses were expended on a scale never seen before. Nearly 2/3 of all VT fuses fired in the entire war were used in the 7 to 12 months of 1945, most of them in the fighting around Okinawa. Those shells accounted for the destruction of over 100 to 200 Japanese aircraft that otherwise might have crashed into carriers, battleships, cruisers, and destroyers. Analysts later concluded that without proximity fuses, losses at Okinawa would have been far greater, quite possibly so great as to force a reconsideration of an invasion of Japan's home islands. The statistics backed up the perceived impact. Post-war studies by the Operations Research Group and similar bodies compared the performance of proximity-fused ammunition to conventional time-fused shells across different theaters and scenarios. They found that VT shells generally made anti-aircraft fire 3 to 4 times more effective. In typical combat, 5-inch guns needed around 2,000 time-fused rounds to bring down an aircraft. With proximity fuses, the average fell into the range of 300 to 600 rounds. Against kamikazes, specific engagements showed improvements of 5 to 10 times in effectiveness. Numbers told only part of the story. For enemy pilots and infantry, the psychological effect of proximity fuses was profound. Japanese pilots flying through curtains of VT-fused flak understood that near misses were now often fatal. The sky around American ships filled with bursts that seemed to anticipate their flight paths. German infantry in Europe learned that American artillery no longer merely churned the ground. Shells detonated above them, sending jagged steel into foxholes, dugouts, and trenches that would once have been safe. There was no reliable shelter, no sure defensive posture. The proximity fuse thus did more than just multiply firepower. It altered how soldiers thought about safety, cover, and exposure, and did so on both sides of the front. In the process, it demonstrated a larger lesson that would echo far beyond World War II. that small, sophisticated electronic devices integrated into traditional weapons could transform their effectiveness. This, in turn, pointed back to the vast machinery that had made the fuse possible, an industrial and scientific mobilization as impressive as any shipyard or bomber plant. While guns thundered in Europe and the Pacific, another kind of struggle unfolded in laboratories and factories across the United States. It was a fight against deadlines, tolerances, and sheer complexity. The effort to turn proximity fuses from rare prototypes into millions of reliable, affordable weapons. By war's end, the United States would produce around 22 million proximity fuses at a cost exceeding $1 billion in 1940s money. That achievement required a manufacturing network spanning more than 110 factories operated by 87 different companies and employing well over 100,000 workers, most of whom never knew what they were truly building. The production story began modestly. In August 1942, the Crosley Corporation of Cincinnati received the first major manufacturing contract. Powell Crosley Jr., who had built his fortune on radios and household appliances, converted his plant almost overnight to fuse production. Security at Crosley's facility was extraordinary. Workers passed through multiple checkpoints to reach their stations. Color-coded badges strictly limited access to different sections of the factory. Mail was censored. Phone calls could be monitored. Employees were forbidden to discuss details of their work, even with close family members. Many believed they were assembling improved radio tubes or components for standard military electronics. Crosley organized its assembly lines into a series of highly specialized stations. At one bench, workers wound minuscule coils of wire with almost microscopic precision. At another, technicians soldered delicate connections. Inspectors checked every 10th unit, watching for flaws too small to see with the naked eye. By December 1942, Crosley was producing about 500 fuses a day. A year later, output had climbed to around 3,000 per day. At its peak in April 1945, the plant turned out roughly 16,500 complete fuses every 24 hours. Other companies joined and expanded the network. RCA converted a facility in Bloomington, Indiana, to fuse assembly in September 1942. Its expertise in mass-produced radio sets translated directly to efficient production methods. RCA engineers refined assembly procedures that shortened build times by nearly 30%. Eastman Kodak contributed more than just labor. Its experience with precision optics and chemistry helped solve problems with photoelectric cells used in some fuse variants. It also developed improved plastic components that could withstand wide temperature swings without cracking or deforming. General Electric operated several plants that fed critical parts into the system. In Schenectady, New York, GE assembled complete fuses. In Cleveland, a factory that had once made Christmas tree lights turned to producing tiny tungsten filaments for the vacuum tubes. The work demanded tolerances measured in thousandths of an inch. A defect invisible without magnification could cause a tube, and therefore an entire fuse, to fail. Sylvania Electric Products became the backbone of vacuum tube production. Its massive plant in Ipswich, Massachusetts, ran 3 shifts a day with around 10,000 workers. Except for Christmas Day, the facility never truly stopped. The factory consumed enough power to supply a small city. Air filtration systems kept dust from contaminating delicate tube interiors. Workers wore special clothing to reduce static electricity. From this single Sylvania plant came roughly 95% of all vacuum tubes used in proximity fuses. At peak output, Ipswich produced roughly 1 million tubes every 2.5 days. By the end of the war, the facility had turned out about 5,683,032 complete fuses, more than any other single location. Smaller and specialized firms filled in the remaining pieces. McQuay Norris Manufacturing Company in St. Louis produced metal shell components. Zenith Radio Corporation in Chicago assembled electronic sub-modules. Wurlitzer, famous for musical instruments and jukeboxes, built precision timing mechanisms. Lionel, known to the public for model trains, machined parts for the fuse assemblies. Together, these firms formed an industrial web that transformed Section T's laboratory design into an object that could be produced by the millions. At first, this came at a staggering cost. Early hand-assembled proximity fuses cost about $732 apiece, more than some automobiles of the era. Such a price was obviously unsustainable for mass use. But as assembly lines improved, designs simplified, and workers gained experience, unit costs plummeted. By 1945, the cost per fuse had fallen to roughly $18, a reduction by a factor of around 40. At that price, given the weapon's 3- to 4-fold improvement in effectiveness, the economics were compelling. Fewer shells per aircraft destroyed meant fewer guns needed, fewer ships lost, fewer pilots and sailors killed. Quality control remained relentless. The National Bureau of Standards created special facilities to test samples from each production batch under harsh environmental conditions. Fuses were exposed to temperatures ranging from 65 degrees Celsius to 160 degrees Celsius, subjected to high humidity and salt spray, shaken on vibration tables, and spun in centrifuges that replicated the acceleration and spin of guns firing. Random samples from each lot were loaded into shells and actually fired to verify real-world performance. If failure rates rose beyond tightly defined thresholds, whole batches were quarantined and production lines examined for defects. This rigorous oversight ensured that a fuse built in winter in New England would work just as reliably in summer heat in the Pacific or freezing conditions in the Ardennes. Despite the enormous numbers produced and fired in combat, the secret of how the fuse worked remained surprisingly well protected. German forces did recover some dud shells with proximity fuses in late 1944, but when their engineers examined the devices, they found the idea almost unbelievable. The notion that intact radio equipment could survive the stresses of artillery firing seemed so implausible that some concluded the fuses must be trick devices or partial failures, not the heart of a fully functional system. German researchers diverted resources into exploring countermeasures against fuse mechanisms that the Allies were not actually using. In the Pacific, Japanese forces collected a handful of DYUD VT shells that had landed on land during bombardments, despite regulations against such firing. Japanese scientists understood the principle of proximity detection. However, by that stage of the war, Japan's electronics industry lagged far behind America's. Their vacuum tubes were larger, less reliable, and difficult to adapt to the extreme miniaturization and ruggedization that the fuse required. Even with physical examples in hand, they lacked the capacity to replicate the weapon at scale before the war's end. After the conflict, leaders tried to capture the fuse's significance in simple, sober language. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal stated that the proximity fuse had helped blaze the trail to Japan. Eisenhower, in his memoirs, reflected that if the Germans had perfected and employed the proximity fuse 6 months earlier than the Allies did, the invasion of Europe might have become exceedingly difficult, perhaps impossible. These were not rhetorical flourishes. They were assessments from men who had lived through the razor-thin margins by which campaigns succeeded or failed. Yet for nearly 2 years, army commanders had been denied the use of this war-winning weapon on land because of institutional caution. In hindsight, many judged that caution excessive. The Pentagon's fears of German imitation, of jamming, of catastrophic bomber losses if the technology spread, were grounded in real possibilities. But they had been weighed more heavily than the immediate, visible casualties suffered by soldiers fighting without the benefit of VT shells. Only when the Battle of the Bulge threatened a major strategic setback did the leadership finally relax the restrictions that to commanders like Eisenhower should have been lifted months before. Beyond the tactical and strategic impact, the proximity fuse program pointed toward a new paradigm in military technology. It showed that electronics and automation could radically enhance traditional weapons like guns and shells. Civilian scientists and engineers when integrated into wartime planning and given clear goals, could solve seemingly impossible problems under intense time pressure. Large-scale industrial cooperation between universities, private companies, and government agencies could turn cutting-edge research into mass-produced hardware in just a few years. Many of Section T's veterans carried this model into the post-war world. James Van Allen went on to discover the radiation belts surrounding the Earth. Others became key figures in America's burgeoning space program. The Applied Physics Laboratory at Johns Hopkins, originally created for the proximity-fuzed effort, continued as a major defense research center, contributing to missile guidance systems, space projects, and more. The basic concept of proximity fusing spread everywhere. Modern anti-aircraft missiles, from short-range shipboard interceptors to long-range systems like the Patriot missiles used decades later against Scud attacks, rely on proximity fuses to determine the moment of detonation. Naval close-in weapon systems, such as the phalanx gun mounts that protect ships against incoming missiles, use proximity fusing to make their streams of fire more lethal. Air-to-air missiles carried by fighters worldwide explode when they come close to their targets, descendants of the tiny radar sets first squeezed into 5-inch shell noses in the 1940s. Most important of all, the proximity fuse saved lives. Naval historians estimate that American casualties in the Pacific would have been 30% to 50% higher without VT-fused shells. Kamikaze attacks might have forced the cancellation of the Okinawa operation. An invasion of Japan, planned for November 1945, could have faced such devastating suicide strikes that its feasibility would have been called into question. In Europe, without proximity-fused artillery, the German offensive in the Ardennes might have driven further and faster, potentially splitting Allied forces. London and Antwerp, denied effective defense against V-1 bombs, might have suffered damage and civilian losses severe enough to trigger evacuation plans or cripple logistics. The war, already the deadliest in history, might have stretched into 1946 or 1947 with millions more casualties. None of this was certain. History offers no controlled experiments, but the margin by which victory was secured was narrow enough that weapons like the proximity fuse almost certainly made the difference. Back on that January morning in 1943, as the sailors on USS Helena watched Japanese dive bombers disintegrate at ranges they had never before seen, they likely did not think in such sweeping terms. They knew only that shells which should have missed had instead brought down enemy aircraft. Their officers, and the scientists and admirals who followed the reports, understood more. They saw that the war had quietly shifted into a new phase, where the combination of scientific innovation and industrial power could be as decisive as courage and numbers. In less than 3 years, American researchers and manufacturers had taken a device regarded as almost impossible, made it real, produced it by the tens of millions, deployed it across 2 continents and 2 oceans, and used it to help win the largest war in human history. The weapon that the Navy had initially guarded so jealously became, when finally released, one of the tools that protected the Allied cause at its most critical moments. The innovation that the Pentagon had feared to place in soldiers' hands at last helped those same soldiers survive. 22 million tiny radars, each no bigger than an ice cream cone, turned the vast sky from a sanctuary for enemy aircraft into a contested killing ground and transformed the way artillery could strike men on the ground. The proximity fuse stands as enduring proof that when the stakes are survival itself, the fusion of science, industry, and hard, risky decisions can reshape the course of history.